driving.
So Fernando, just sorry, somebody was gonna say something, but really quickly. So it's gonna be myself, Domingo, and Justina, right? That's the order.
Yeah, let me pull it up.
'Cause John won't be here.
Yeah, and then
Michelle won't be
Michelle,
here.
yeah.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure. And we have like, how long did you say we had?
All right, so we used to have 4 papers. We currently have 3, I believe. And I had asked folks to keep their presentations to 8 to 10 minutes, but since we've lost 1 paper, we can have a little bit more wiggle room there. So I'll start signaling at around 10 to be aware that you should close in about 2 minutes, giving you a total of 12 if you need them. If not, give them back to us because we'll definitely enjoy having a good conversation with our discussants. Guillermo, Caballero, thank you for joining, and also Danielle, Clealand. Also, thank you for joining, Danielle. And just so you all know, I believe that this is going to get live streamed on the NCOBPS Facebook page. So just wanted to make you all aware of that. And we only have an hour, so I want to make sure that we make the most out of it. And I'd usually ask folks to, wait 5 minutes to let people trickle in, but an hour doesn't give us much time. So I think I'm gonna start very quickly introducing the panel. And we are, in theory, hosting NCOBPS in Baltimore. So I wanna acknowledge that Baltimore is the land of the Piscataway and Shuswap peoples. And over time, citizens of many more indigenous nations have come to reside in this region. So we offer our respect and solidarity to those who have been in struggle in this land, and welcome you all to this Afro-Latinx politics panel. Thank you, Danielle, for bringing me in as a chair last year, and for encouraging me to stay just in service of this community that we're excited to keep growing. And thank you, Yalidy, for being a fantastic chair of this section as well, and putting together some wonderful panels. So Yalidy, I want to kick it over to you quickly so you can invite folks to join the Author Meets Critic panel as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Fernando. Thank you everyone for being here with Fernando. I co-chair this section, and on Saturday at 12:15, we have an Author Meets Critic with Tanya K. Hernandez, who is her forthcoming book, which will be coming out in August, called Racial Innocence, Latino Anti-Black Bias, and something more that I cannot remember at the moment, but I should probably have that flyer up. So that's on Saturday, 12:15. It's a little bit of a longer panel. And so we'll have Frederick Harris, Devin Carbado, and Nancy Lopez as the quote unquote critics, panelists, and I will be moderating. But it should be a really great conversation, and it's an incredible topic, a timely topic that I think we all need to be talking about, both in Black politics, but Latino politics especially as well. So hopefully we'll see you all there.
Thank you, Yalidy. And for those who might not be registered in the conference, let your colleagues know that it'll also be live streamed so others can join. Certainly a really important topic in Afro-Latinx politics. So let's get started, and we'll follow the order that we had in our program, which has changed slightly, but we'll start with Professor Yalidy Matos, and who will be presenting at the intersection of Afro-Latinidad and gender. So Yalidy, thank you. I'll notify you when we're around 10 minutes, okay?
Sounds good. Hopefully I won't take more than 10 minutes because I do want a good amount of time on discussion. So let me share my screen here and hopefully this will all work out. Okay, everybody see my screen? Okay, so first, this is just the flyer. So it's called Racial Innocence: Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias in the Struggle for Equality. So this is the book, and so hopefully you can all make it. And okay, can everybody see that? Awesome. Okay, so as Fernando mentioned, this is a piece that I've just recently wrapped up called At the Intersection of Afro-Latinidad and Gender. And I will go through just some of what's in the piece, just thinking about time here. But I did want to start with this quote, which I used at the starting of the paper by Leila Gonzalez, who's an Afro-Brazilian anthropologist. And she says, "When I speak of my own experience, I am talking about a long process of learning which occurred in my search for an identity as a Black woman within a society which oppresses me and discriminates against me because I am Black. But a question of an ethical and political nature arises immediately. I cannot speak in the first person singular of something which is painfully common to millions of women who live in the region. Those Amir Africans who are opposed by a Latinness which legitimizes their inferiority." And I just thought that this quote by Gonzalez really captured some of what I had been thinking about, feeling, sort of contemplating for quite some time now. I really liked the piece that went from personal to sort of plural and political, right? That when she starts to think about being a Black Latin American woman, she can't really just think about herself, right? But that she's actually a part of this much larger region and larger sort of movement and experience of Black Latin American women who are oppressed by a certain kind of Latinidad, right? That doesn't necessarily include them. And so I wanted to really delve into this work. And I had this sort of expectation / argument that identifying as Afro-Latina is different than identifying as a Latina, and that it really signals much more of an intersectional and coalitional sort of group consciousness. And so I wanted to figure out the role of Latinas' racial identification on their racial and gender attitudes, as well as their broader political behavior. And so I first examined in the paper Latinas' racial self-identification, focusing on comparing Afro-Latinas to either white identifying or simply those Latinas who identify as Latina. And then I also wanted to compare self-identified Afro-Latinas with Afro-Latinas who also say that they are racially Black. And I had this sort of like lived experience, right? That those two things were going to mean not necessarily completely different things, but that it was going to matter politically, and for various reasons, right? If you are socialized sort of in Latin America or within that particular or particular kinds of cultures, right? Anti-Blackness is sort of prevalent across the Americas, right? And across the world. And so being part of my particular community, I always thought, right, that there was a sense of like empowerment that comes with identifying yourself as Black, but also a courage of doing so, right? Especially if you're like come from a family where most people don't, or if you come from a community where most people don't, or where you learn sort of various natures of anti-Blackness. And so those were my comparisons, and my research question sort of asked, what factors are significant for Latinas and Afro-Latinas self-identity, and what are the political consequences of this identity? So I have various hypotheses, and I won't go through all of them during the presentation. But the first thing is I really expected that there would be differences in racial identity among Latinas, right? That there is going to be some Latinas who identified as white Latinas, some Latinas who identified just as Latinas, and that there would be Afro-Latinas and some Latinas, right, who also racially identified as Black and multiracial, so on and so forth, right? And then I had a few expectations of what might influence self-identification. So skin color is one of those. This idea that whether you think that racism exists in the United States. So I looked at that. I looked at levels of racial resentment. And I also looked at experiences with racial discrimination or racialized discrimination as a whole, both at the group level and the personal level. And then hypothesis 3A and B are about the differences between Afro-Latinas and Black identified Afro-Latinas as being distinct. And given that Black Afro-Latinas are not the prototypical members of the group, my expectation is that identifying as Black Afro-Latinas will influence them by identifying with Black Americans and Black group consciousness, and less so with Latino group consciousness. And this goes back to the sort of like oppression within a Latinx that Gonzalez talks about in the epigraph. And finally, self-identified non-Afro-Latinas are going to be the least likely to have coalitional politics compared to Afro-Latinas and Black Afro-Latinas in that order. Okay, and so I just have two aspects of the results here. So this is the first one, and hopefully you can see this better, and it shows up on my computer. But this is the odds ratio of what predicts Afro-Latinidad, and this is using an original survey that was fielded in 2020 using Qualtrics. And so I look at different factors here. So whether you're US born, education level, age, different kinds of discrimination, racial resentment, and just some of the typical things that you will see in a model. I also looked at different kinds of linked fate and also control for Mexican and Puerto Rican women in the survey. And so this just shows that, and this is also 3 different models. The blue is for Afro-Latinas, and I think I mislabeled this. The green is for Black Afro-Latinas. And then I definitely mislabeled this somehow, so my apologies. Okay, but we'll focus on the blue and burgundy in comparison to the green here. And so some of what this shows is that for Black Afro-Latinas, being US born increases their identity as Black Afro-Latinas, which sort of makes sense, right? Because there's socialization in the US, you're more socialized into the sort of US racial categories. Other sort of prevalent and consistent findings throughout is racialized discrimination increases Latinas' identity as Afro-Latina and Black Afro-Latinas. Party ID here is significant for Black Afro-Latinas in the positive direction. And so for what's really interesting here is that for the first 2 models, Latina linked fate is positively related to identifying as Afro-Latina. And for Black Afro-Latinas, it is negatively associated, right? Which is one of the hypotheses I had, right? That Black Afro-Latinas were going to feel less sort of groupness with other Latinos, given that anti-Blackness is so prevalent. Whereas Afro-Latinas might not feel that way, given that they've not sort of identified themselves racially as Black. For Black Afro-Latinas as well, it's significant that they feel linked fate with Black women, and this is not significant for the other two models. And I think that's about it in terms of significance. I found that this was pretty consistent with the other data that I used. So I used the 2016 CMPS as well as the 2020 CMPS. So identifying as Afro-Latina compared to not identifying as Afro-Latina is influenced negatively by age, as well as agreeing that discrimination against women is no longer a problem in the US. Having darker skin color is positively correlated with identifying as Afro-Latina, as well as expressions of Latino or Latina linked fate. However, for Black linked fate, it's negatively associated with identifying as Afro-Latinas. And this is in comparison to Black Afro-Latinas, which is positively correlated with higher levels of Black linked fate and negatively associated with Latino linked fate. So that comes from the other examples that I have in the paper. And just to give you a sense of one of the coalitional outcomes that I looked at, which was support for Black Lives Matter. And this is a 2016 CMPS. And so here there's two models, one for Afro-Latinas, which is the blue, and the burgundy, which is for Black Afro-Latinas. And so you see that the Afro-Latina model, the main independent variable here is up here, and for the other one is down here. And so here you can see a little bit clearer, right? Afro-Latinas are more likely to support Black Lives Matter compared to non-Afro-Latinas, right? Black Afro-Latinas are even more likely to support Black Lives Matter. And this is the odds ratio. The other things are pretty consistent, right? Knowing what Black Lives Matter is, right, increases the possibility that you're gonna support it. Latino group discrimination is significant for both models here. Personal discrimination is significant, even more so for Black Afro-Latinas. Skin color is significant for Afro-Latinas, although not so much for Black Afro-Latinas.
Yalidy, we're at 12.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so that was for the coalitional. And so we can have more discussion about it. Time goes really fast, but I think that this piece really intervenes in sort of Black politics, women politics, and Latino politics. And we can talk and chat more about it during discussion. That way I don't take any more time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So let's hear next from our colleague Justina Blanco, who will be presenting her paper, Elaine Locke, Race Contracts in Latin America. Welcome, Justina.
Thank you. Sorry, I thought I was going third. One moment.
Do you prefer a verbal notification of 2 minutes left or on the chat? Up to you.
I think the chat should be fine.
The chat? Okay, right. Sounds good.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Justina Blanco. I am a junior political science major with a focus in political theory, philosophy, and Africana Studies double minor at Howard University. And today I'll be presenting my project, Relative Racisms, Elaine Locke, Race Contacts in Latin America. So to begin, I want to talk a little bit about who Elaine Locke is. So he was born in 1885, died in 1994, a philosopher, writer, educator, considered the father of the Harlem Renaissance, the curator of the Harlem Renaissance, first Black Rhodes Scholar, professor at Howard University. And his philosophical interests, which are particularly important here, include value theory, cultural relativism, race theory, and aesthetics. So his work really contributed to the birth of Black studies, which of course occurred decades later, but he created that foundation. So my research question is, to what extent are Elaine Locke's conceptions of race applicable within a Latin American context? And how do the similarities and differences between these racial contexts, what do they say about what race is as an abstract concept? So the literature that I considered, of course, Race, Context, and Interracial Relations, lectures that Elaine Locke gave in 1916 that outlined his conceptions of race, which we'll talk about more. But also Franz Boas' new evidence in regard to the instability of human types, which was radical when it was published in 1911, challenging ideas of polygenesis, which were still common within the academy. The idea being race is not actually an indicator of superiority or inferiority. And Locke is in conversation with this in his race contact papers. So Negro in the Three Americas. Now, while Race Contact in 1916 does not talk about Latin America, Negro in the Three Americas does. And this was in lectures given in 1944 in Haiti. And so this is in conversation with the Caribbean and Latin America and the American context. And so we can begin to see what Locke thinks about Latin America a little bit more, but we still need to investigate how his theory actually applies, not just the differences, but what does that say about race? And then to talk about the context of Latin America, I used The History of Race Relations in Latin America primarily by Magnus Morner. This was published in 1966, but still provides a relevant and in-depth theoretical analysis of race origins in Latin America. And finally, Robert Vitalis, White World Order, Black Power Politics, The Birth of American International Relations. Now, this talks about American international relations specifically, but his investigation of the racial context that contribute to this are really important, and you can see the conversation between Locke and this work, and Vitalis talks about Locke specifically. So the Race Contact lectures. These were 5 separate lectures presented in 1916 at Howard University, based in sociological and anthropological analysis. But the final paper is where we see more of a political analysis, as he talks about what change could look like and the stability and instability of race relations. So he defines race, discusses the origin of race, the political conceptions of race, and fallacies and rules of progress as he sees it. Important concepts here include the sense of kinship, which could be related to warlike tendencies, differences between modern and ancient empires, racial amalgamation and its controversial status in scholarship, race as an extension of class, and of course, cultural relativism. So what I'm doing in this paper is first outlining Locke's theory of race, major assumptions therein, and justifications, then determining the relevant distinctions between the political and racial realities in a Latin American context and compared to an Anglo-American context. Finally, applying Locke's theory to a Latin American racial framework and determining the implications of this application. So this is an outline of Locke's theory. And of course, he goes far more in depth within these 5 lectures. But generally what he's saying is that first, race begins as this extension of class. And so this imposition of European civilization upon the social life of another group in order to economically control that group. And so this means that this dominant group dictates the hierarchy within and through the lens of their own will and traditions. Next is assimilation through social coercion. And this we can see in both Anglo and Latin context, where individuals are coerced into assimilating because social privileges are the reward for assimilation. And this can also facilitate blood intermixture, which Locke talks about next, which is what he's referring to is interracial relations. And so third, blood intermixture and the creation of a new class. And so this, he says, works as a buffer. This class being more acceptable and allowed more privileges and closeness to the dominant group. Next, social definitions become legal. So he saw race functioning as a social reality, which then presents in legal doctrine. So this direction is really important in this conversation. And he says that this often happens without explicit discrimination as in order to insulate the legal manifestations of race. And an example of this could be prescribed or restricted residence areas. And finally, instability. Locke says that the race relations are inherently unstable, and these times of instability and change result in violent reactions. Now he's talking about from both directions. So this could be seen in race riots, or it could be seen in rebellion and resistance. And so change leads to reactions, and these reactions lead to a response. And so it is this back and forth within these racial frameworks. Finally, Locke ends in a very optimistic note. He sees this instability in point 5 as an opportunity for racial progress. So he says that in these times of instability, we have the potential to control these systems in that time of flux. He also pointed out that racial antipathy subsided when dominant groups did not feel threatened. And so it's this balance between challenging racial structures in flux while existing through the violent changes that occur in those times of flux. So the major differences between Anglo and Latin American. So I have first through Locke's perspective and then Mourner's. So Locke saw the 3 main differences as population, mixed population, and different theoretical frameworks. So I am using modern population distributions. It is difficult to get reliable racial population distributions in Latin America, particularly during colonialism. But looking at modern racial distributions, we can see the impact of historical racial distribution. So while in the Anglo context, 98%, so sorry about that. That should actually be 82% white in Anglo context, but only 12 to 97% in Latin American context. And so these different ratios will contribute to the way that race develops within these contexts. Next, mixed populations. So virtually every Latin American family in the region after a few generations will experience some form of intermixture, and that Locke attributes to the different theoretical framework as well as the population realities that within Latin America. So Locke cites the French Revolution, Catholicism, and its universality compared to the exclusivity of Protestantism, and this idea of Latin social tolerance, which we can still see today, which I love that conversation is happening on Saturday, because these ideas of racial democracy are still prevalent. And Morner, it cites somewhat similar differences. First, ideology, the corporate system that existed within Spain during colonization. This system, would have separated society into industrial and professional groups, which he credits to the development of the pigmentocracy and these different, not necessarily hierarchical groups within Latin America. Catholicism and this idea of limpieza de sangre, which comes from Spain. So this motivation to mix to white in your family line, which contributes to mixing, which he discusses in point 3. So also the Latin American economy was very different. So profitable enterprises tend to be harsher during slavery. That is the general belief, and this idea also contributes to this idea of racial democracy over more benign slavery within a Latin American context. And while a lot of that is propaganda to a certain extent, these different economic frameworks contribute to the experiences of slavery and the social positions of Africans and indigenous peoples within Latin America. So Africans were socially closer to Europeans and often worked as household servants, while indigenous people worked as mine slaves or as cattle hands, which even in the American context experienced more freedom. Next, the gender ratio, which is another issue. So not only are Europeans outnumbered in Latin America, most numbers will say that it's about 1 to 10 gender ratio. There are very few women that came with the Spanish into Latin America. And so this, of course, leads to more mixing in order to maintain the population. So Europeans within Latin America would need a different strategy in order to maintain dominance and cultural influence. Finally, racial structure. And this, he identifies that Latin America is much more phenotypical. And so the categories include Spaniards, Castas, Mestizos, Mulattoes, Indians. All of these are defined by phenotype and are very changeable and complex. So Morner writes that Indian might wish to pass for mestizo in order to escape paying tribute. The mestizo may find it convenient to present himself as Indian to escape the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. This shows that we're not talking about a simple hierarchy as we are in an Anglo context. It is more complex than that, in different situations will benefit different ethnic groups, but also that changed over time. He cites that military organization allowed pardos to gain social mobility, but laws may favor intermarriage between mestizos and Europeans, which allows mestizos a certain level of social power as well. And he claims that this different racial structure and its changeability and complexity contribute to a more individualized conception of race and experience of race. So applying Locke's theory. So first we have this idea of imposition, which Spanish cultural control. So far we see a consistency in the application of this theory through language, culture, dress. The Spanish were able
Justina, we're at 12.
Oh, so sorry about that. I didn't see the notification.
It's okay. You can wrap up.
Thank you. And so the important differences that I found in application are instability and violence. So if instability leads to change, the Latin American racial structure is consistently unstable. So what does that say about how racial structures will evolve? And in terms of progress, how we've seen the increased legal and scholarly attention, but also this speaks to the influence between Anglo and Latin Americans in modern day. So the conclusion is race is not real and therefore never universal and never constant. And these implications I do want to talk about before we leave. America is changing. Gen Z includes a high percentage of people of color, 1 in 4 Latina, 22% have at least one immigrant parent. So we're going to see an ideological influence of these in these changes, but also by 2026, the majority of Gen Z is going to be non-white. So what does this mean for so how can we look at Latin America as a guide to what these changes will look like in the United States? How will race evolve? And so Latin America can work as a touchstone for developing this framework, and to say that greater nominal representation does not mean change. Elaine Locke's call for cultural relativism is still different, and investigating the ideological and theoretical foundations that that come with racial categories is still important, even as we gain the nominal representation. Sorry, and thank you.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so next up, we will be hearing from Yalidy Matos, Michelle Bueno Vásquez, and Domingo Morel about their study, Are Dominicans the Sleeping Giant? Dominican-American Elite Political Power in the United States. All right, I'll kick it over to you all.
Thank you, Fernando. I can't see, I think we have to remove the spotlight for Justina. There we go. Can everyone see this? Okay, perfect. So we changed the title, as often is the case in conferences. So the title of our presentation is Dominican Political Elites and the Understudied Aspects of Black and Latino Politics in the US, right? And so this is a co-authored project between Yalidy, myself, and Michelle Bueno Vasquez out of Northwestern University, who unfortunately can't be with us today. Dominican Americans are one of the fastest growing subgroups in Latino subgroups in the United States, but we know very little in terms of the politics and specifically political science scholarship on Dominicans, right? And so one search we did on Dominican political incorporation resulted in 2 books and 1 article as listed there. Yalidy and I have been working on other projects trying to understand Dominican-American politics. And what we found in a previous paper is that the interaction of population size, institutional context, and civic organizations play a significant role in shaping Dominican political incorporation. So in addition to this, and one of the things that are important to note, as has already been kind of indicated in terms of race politics in Latin America, this is specifically with Dominicans, is that over 90% of Dominicans have some African ancestry. And so, I'm sorry, I gotta move this because it's kind of covering my, So the absence of a study of Dominican-American politics also contributes to an understudied aspect of Black politics in the US. And so here we have 2 images, one of Congressman Adriano Espaillat from New York City, and Lieutenant Governor, someone Tonya Fina and I know very well, Lieutenant Governor Sabina Matos out of Rhode Island, both who consider themselves both Afro-Latino, Afro-Latina, and Black, right? And so here's just some examples of some of the Dominican elected officials and their identification with Blackness. So in this project, which is, I think is important for us to know, we are in the very early stages of developing this project. So any insight that you have about directions would be greatly appreciated here. But here are some of the questions that we're thinking about. So building off the other work that Yalidy and I had worked on, scholarship that we had worked on, how important are institutional context and organizations for Dominican elites? Since we find that the growth of Dominican political incorporation is very closely related to these different contexts, we wanted to see how Dominican elites fit into this. Can Dominican elites serve as a link for Black and Latino political coalitions? And this is again building off the image, the prior slide that I showed, where we have Dominican elected officials who identify as Black. And then are there institutional constraints that limit Black Latino participation in Black political institutions, right? So we constructed a data set, to our knowledge, the first survey of Dominican elected officials in the United States. Is an online Qualtrics survey of, again, we think is the universe of Dominican-American elected officials, right? And so we have different data gathering methods from Google searches, from interviews with other Dominican elected officials, information from the Dominican Studies Institute, information from Yalidy. If I'm missing, again, something, please just add on. But we have different sources to compile the database of Dominican elected officials. So we think this is the universe of Dominican elected officials. And so we conducted a survey between November 2021 and January 2022. There were altogether 49 elected officials who were sent surveys, and 28 responded for 57% response rate. So just some descriptives, Dominican elites of those who responded to our survey. First of all, as you can see here from this map of the United States, it's heavily concentrated in the Northeast, right? And so Dominican elected officials predominantly in states of New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and less so, but still significantly, there's a presence in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Florida. So from the aspect of Latino politics, right? So the analysis, the examination of Dominican elected officials already presents a different picture than what other Latino scholarship would show, right? Which would be dominant in the West Coast or the Southwest, and to some degree in Florida. So Dominicans present a different aspect of Latino politics based on region, right? The Northeast. And since this is also, we are arguing here, there's an element of Black politics that's understudied as well. From the Black politics perspective, this also introduces new insight, right? In terms of region and Black politics. Rhode Island is really not known, right, for a place of analysis for Black politics, right, nationally, but or Massachusetts for that matter, right. Of course, there is research there, but it's not really a dominant place for Black politics as it would be Chicago, Philadelphia, and clearly places in the South. So we think that this region and the concentration of Dominican elected officials presents new insights and understanding of Black and Latino politics from that perspective. In terms of place of birth, over 70% of those who responded to our survey were actually born in the Dominican Republic. In terms of gender breakup, 50%, 57% women, 43% men. In terms of race, about 40% identify as Black, another 25% or so identify as Black mixed with either white or other, less so white, and about roughly 26.7% or so identify as other. So this is in terms of race identity. And then in terms of political party identification, overwhelming Democratic Party identification, so 60+% identify strongly as Democrat, and then less so, way less so way less so Republicans or independents in our survey. And although many identify strongly as Democrat, we can see here that there's not that strong of identification in terms of ideology, right? So we have a moderate, about 35% or so moderate, 30% or so somewhat liberal, and so forth. And so then part of our questions here is trying to understand the political and institutional factors that lead to Dominican elected officials getting elected. And so we find that most are, 60% are getting elected in local government, right? We asked several questions about the types of institutions, political institutions. And one key question for us is what if they consider civic and political organizations important in the emergence of their political careers, right? And so consistent with our research and consistent with other research that shows how community organizations play an important role in the emergence of elected officials of color, we find that for Dominicans, this applies, right? That nearly 80% of them consider civic and political organizations an important part of the emergence of their political careers. And then here we have some other questions: election type, whether we're partisan or nonpartisan, about 50%. Election cycle, most, about 65% or so, participate in elections that were off cycle. So this is not surprising given that most of them are at the local level. And then finally, we had a question about whether their election was a district election or at-large election. We find that most of them were, about 55% or so, were elected based on district elections rather than at-large elections. Then we also asked a question about how important is it for you to learn the needs of your Dominican constituents, and overwhelmingly, the survey, the respondents said that it is extremely important to very important for them to understand the needs of the Dominican constituents. So then transitioning to the race question here, Black and Latino, where do Dominicans fit? So as I already showed, right, we have about 40% of Dominican elected officials in our survey saying that they identify as Black, with another 25% or so saying that they are Black and mixed with other, either white or other, right? And then we asked a question about Afro-Latino identity, and over 60% of the respondents identify as Afro-Latino or Afro-Dominican. Right? And so we don't have a lot of research on elected officials across the country and racial identity across the country, but we believe that this is probably among the higher, if not the highest, right, types of Afro-Latino identity and Black identity that we will find across the Latino subgroups in the United States. If there is data on that and people want to challenge us on that, be happy to engage, but that's what we suspect, right? And so then we asked a question about linked fate, right? And so these Dominican elected officials and how they view linked fate with other Latinos, with Dominicans as a whole, with African Americans, and with non-Hispanic whites, right? And so we see that about 50% say that they have they share linked fate with Latinos and Dominicans, and over 40% with African Americans, and less than 20% for with whites. And so we did t-tests to test if there was any significance in the means between the groups. And we find that there is no statistical significance difference between linked fate with Dominicans and linked fate with Latinos and linked fate with African Americans. However, we do find a statistically different in means for compared to non-Hispanic whites, right? And so we see that there is evidence here for Dominican elected officials feeling linked fate with other Latinos, Dominicans, and African Americans. And so given these feelings of linked fate and identification as Black and or Afro-Latino or Afro-Dominican, part of the question here is, are Dominicans, kind of positioned to serve as a link between Black and Latino communities, given that they feel that they are both, right? And so one of the things, questions that we have here is, it seems that that might be the case, but that there are also institutional barriers that prevent that from actually manifesting, right? And so here again, we have Congressman Adriano Espaillat, who wants to be part of the Congressional Black Caucus, right? And has not been given, he hasn't been allowed to participate in this. And here's a quote from him, right? On this question of, are you going to continue to seek membership into the caucus? And he says, I am persistent and I will continue to knock on the door because I don't think someone else has a right to define my Blackness or to determine whether I am a Black man or not, right? So, our implications and conclusions, again, this is very early on in the project. So we basically, we would greatly appreciate any comments, thoughts, or future direction for this project. But what we conclude here is, most Dominican elected officials identify as Afro-Latino. Although little research exists on Black identity among Latino elected officials, our findings suggest that Dominican elected officials complicate our understanding of Latino and Black politics in the US. Further research is needed to examine the similarities or differences between racial identities as expressed by Dominican elected officials and the Dominican-American public in general, right? So there's reasons to suspect, and there's more and more research being done on this, that the Dominican-American general public might not feel the same way as the Dominican elites, but further research is needed in this area. And then our findings on linked fate suggest that Dominican elites may be able to play an important role as a link for Black and Latino coalitions. However, the political institutions as currently designed limit those possibilities. So I'll end it there, and happy to engage in conversation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Domingo and Yalidy and Michelle. I am going to kick it over to Danielle for some feedback, and then to Guillermo.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody for being here. I'm really excited about this panel, and I'm really happy that this section continues to be part of NCOBPS, because I think it's a really great generative space. So I'll try to be fast because I know we have 15 minutes. So I have comments much longer than the ones I'm about to give, but I can send those via email since we have time constraints. So with first paper, with Yalidy's paper, let me see what I have so many comments. What can I, how can I pare this down? So I think one of the main questions that I have is kind of thinking about, so first, I saw skin color in your BLM analysis, but I didn't see skin color in likelihood to identify as Afro-Latina. And so I'm wondering how this factors in. Are there Black, I mean, I've looked at a lot of the CMPS, but I haven't looked at this particular question. Are there Black Latinas that are saying they're not Afro-Latina? And so what is the kind of relationship between skin color? Because I would think that that would be the first kind of variable, right, that would determine identification with Afro-Latinidad. I also wanted to ask you about this idea of coalitional politics, because I mean, if you remember, there was a lot of talk about those signs that said, Latinos or Latinx is supporting Black Lives Matter, and the whole, the problem with that was, well, okay, but Latinos are Black too. And so when we think about Afro-Latinas and Black Lives Matter, is that coalitional politics, or is it just Black folks supporting Black Lives Matter? And so I wanted to kind of probe that a little bit and ask you to think about that. And I think I'm going to stop there. I really like this paper, and I really like the fact that you're making these connections between identity in Latin America and then the way that Afro-Latinos would identify. The last thing I want to say is that I think that, and I think about this a lot in my work as well, if there's a way that we can talk about identifying as Black that recognizes that often it can be a political stance to identify as Black, but at the same time, the role of mestizaje doesn't weaken our Blackness as much as it's been said to, if that makes sense, right? So you have this mestizaje and these whitening ideals that push us to not identify as Black, but we still have these strong identities. And so how do we kind of, talk about that and do justice to Black identity and Afro-Latinos identifying as Black, but then also talking about this issue with the distancing? Because I think both are happening at the same time. It's not one or the other, which you kind of, talk about a little bit in your piece. But I think it should kind of be brought out more how we talk about both. So we're not making the argument that, nobody wants to identify as Black, right? People do. And so and so I think the paper is kind of moving us to figure out what determines that. So for the second paper, move down here for Justina. Thank you so much for this paper. I have a lot of suggestions as far as things to read. If you're interested in kind of keeping this project going. The first one that came to me was Juliet Hooker's work on theorizing the Americas. And she's really thinking about theorists, right, in Latin America, in the US, and how these ideas can travel. But this was really, really a great paper. And one of my questions was about this kind of blood mixture idea and the mixed population. And so I'm interested to know what the differences are to you. So what does it mean to be mixed in the US versus being mixed in Latin America? And does having these kind of multiple categories change how racism operates, right? Because racial identification and racial mixing is unstable, as you said, but racial hierarchies are very stable. And so does it matter, right, that these middle categories are constantly in flux when the racial hierarchy continues to remain the same, and Blackness and whiteness means the same thing at all times? And then for the last piece, I'm really excited about this. So my first question is, obviously, being an elite within government changes the way that folks think about race for some reason. And so I think that's really the crux of this question, right? What is the difference? What is producing the difference? Because if we look on the last census, on the last community survey, 12.4% of Dominicans identified as Black, right? And we're lucky because I was just looking at this yesterday, so it's in my brain. So 12.4 identify as Black. And so if 40% of government officials are identifying as Black and 65% or so are identifying as Afro-Latino, then what's producing that difference is being in that space, right? Actually making folks think about racial identity in different ways, which I think is super interesting. I'm also wondering what the influence of country of birth is and if that matters. And then I would follow up this survey with interviews just to have a better idea of what folks are thinking, and perhaps if the way that they viewed race and their relationship with Black politics actually did change, once they entered into government. And then maybe thinking about, you pointed out these regional differences, and, maybe looking at Latino elected officials in the Northeast and their connections to Black communities is different. And so I think that's also, particularly because these communities are so close, right? I mean, me being from New York, that's the first thing I think about. But if we maybe compare New York and Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut, right, do we find differences? I mean, do we find similarities as far as, how elected officials interact with Black caucuses or, Black politicians in general, Black constituencies, et cetera. So yeah, this was great. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, Danielle. We'll kick it over to Guillermo. Thank you, Guillermo.
Thank you. I just want to give a shout out to my big bro, Fernando, for help incorporating me in this and helping share the labor with folks. And so thank you for having me in this space. I'm extremely excited. I learned so much from the presentations and the papers, and I was super excited to read through all of them. So hold on, just pulling up my comments. So first for Yalidy. So overall, I think this paper is amazing. It has so much substance. And like I told you earlier, I can't wait for it to get published because I would assign it for all the classes that I teach, right? To complicate these conversations. And I think it's so timely important, right? I mean, I think it's always been timely, but I think the way that we started to have this mainstream conversation, right? You're picking up on, you're bringing this conversation that at least I've noticed for a while, but you're bringing it into, into forcing folks in scholarship to engage with it, right? And so and I'm also super excited. I really love when you use the cosmic race guy. I don't know. I remember reading the piece and I was like, damn, Latinidad is racist as fuck. And I remember learning that, and I was like, oh shit, okay, now I get it. Because I grew up in Boston, and I grew up in a big Black Caribbean community, right? And so I didn't know that folks that were I know that racism and white supremacy exists. I didn't realize how deeply structured and connected Latinidad and Hispanic, right, was. And some of the citations that you use. I do have some questions. I'm really gonna focus just on two, and they're kind of outside of the scope of the paper, but I'm really curious of what you think. And I'll send the rest of the questions to you via email of specifics. So the first one is very general. I'm wondering, is this two papers, right? And I could be wrong, right? Because I think you did a beautiful job of having all the moving pieces align, right? So that strategy that you had at the end of the historical context, you brought us back to the questions. But I'm wondering if maybe this could be two papers where one, you're talking about political consciousness and another talking about political coalition. So I was at the end of it, I was wondering, is this really two papers? And I could be wrong, but it was just something I was thinking about. The second overall question is, when I was reading the first half of the paper, I was thinking about Nadia Brown's work on hair texture and how people identify and the role, I'm thinking of one piece about hair texture structured the behavior of Black women lawmakers. And so I'm wondering, and I know, I guess the survey, I don't think captures that at all. So this is kind of out of the scope. And so this is one of those questions of do you think that phenotype and hair texture play a role when it comes to Afro-Latinidad in this paper, right? So I'm curious in your thoughts on that. Yeah, and all the other, so those are the two major comments. All the other ones I'll send to you. Justina, so as I told you earlier, I was only able to read the first half of the paper, so I'll read the second half and send you comments. I really did enjoy this, and I loved your writing on this, and I wish that in my research methods class, undergrads would bring this type of work in there. And so kudos to you. So I'm extremely impressed. I think the two questions that I'm going to focus on, one is like a suggestion. In writing, make sure that you're careful about not using too many block quotes, because at times I felt like I lost your voice and I wanted to hear more your voice in this. And it's not that your voice completely vanished, but as I'm reading, right, I'm getting lost in how you're trying to lead me to from point A to point B to point C, right, to your end argument. So, and having big block quotes, I get lost a little bit, right? So I think it's being careful with that. And not to say that they weren't important in like how you were framing and structuring the paper, but I think just being careful with that, right? The second thing that I was curious about, in the first section of the paper, you kept writing race relations. And something that I've been thinking about is like the purpose of words and how we use words, particularly in the academic setting. And your Elaine Locke, am I pronouncing his name right? Elaine Locke, right? He frames it a little differently though, right? He's not just talking about like the relations between different groups. He's really thinking the role of colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacy, right? And how it structures, right, society, and like how it shapes the identifications and right. And so in the first half, I'm wondering if like being purposeful with your language, and if Elaine Locke, if you're thinking with Elaine Locke and other folks, right, the importance of not just saying race relations. And this is just something I've been thinking about a lot, and I feel like it would strengthen the first part to be more connected, right? Because I felt like it's still, all of it's still connected, but that race relation in terms of that writing, right? Because it kind of like obscures white supremacy, capitalism, right? Colonialism, and I'm sure like heteropatriarchy as well, right? So that was just the two things that I was thinking about. Domingo, love the presentation. I think in terms of what you're asking in terms of suggestions, something that I was thinking about closer to the end of the presentation, I'm wondering if maybe one way you can, and I don't know if you're already doing this, but something I was thinking about that for me kind of stuck out was this idea of districts, right? And particularly at the local level, and thinking about the connections between Black Dominicans and Black folks, right? Or Black folks are like in the broader sense of like like the diasporic or African Americans, right? And so I'm wondering if thinking with Loveland, thinking with Gross, thinking with folks that have looked at districts and legislative behavior, I'm wondering if there's census data that you can collect in elections over time to see what the coalition was, right? So Loveland writes about how Puerto Ricans are reliable Democratic voters, and in certain districts, coalition with Black folks, in this case, African Americans, can get more Black folks elected into positions of office, right? And so this is one way that I'm thinking would be like a really good way to, right? And there's a ton of different models to that we have already in Black politics, right? And then I'm thinking of the second part that I'm thinking that would be interested is then looking at the relationship of the different legislative behaviors at the state and local level. So in this case, for state legislatures, right, are their staff African Americans or Black Dominicans, right? Are they voting in what ways do they advocate for bill sponsorship? What does it look like for their roll call votes, right? Or even thinking about their constituency service, right? Where do they put their attention and time? And seeing, and then I think it gets to this part of the conversation of this link between Black Dominicans and African Americans, right? In terms of Black politics, I think it kind of gets to that. And then the third part that I think might be good too is this is kind of reminded me of my work of interrogating this idea of political power. And so my work focuses on understanding how it's conceptualized, but understanding the implications of how we kind of like narrow our view of domination. And so one of the things that I was thinking about that I think might need more qualitative work versus survey work is if you're looking at discrimination, you could use, here I'm thinking about, I think Carrie Haney's work and other folks where they look at prestigious committeeships, right? But that conversation is kind of complicated because Catherine Tate points out to us that even if they're not on prestigious committees, right, the committees that they're on might service Black folks a lot more because of the certain jobs or whatever the responsibilities are, right? And so I'm curious to think about the different measures, but also thinking about qualitative work and how Black Dominicans actually have to navigate the actual institution, right? And so we know patriarchy exists, right? And structuring in terms of informal institutions. So this could be an avenue. This is where some of my work comes in, and I felt like it highlighted. But then also, what role does xenophobia or white supremacy play? How are they read, right? How are they treated? Does some of these attitudes and behaviors from their actual colleagues in terms of the informal institution structure their behavior and how they navigate formal politics, right? And so those, I'm thinking of like different directions, right? And who I'm kind of thinking along with in terms of your presentation, but that's it. That's what I got.
This is amazing. This has been really enriching and really exciting also to follow the chat where folks are exchanging really great comments, ideas, and support for all of the presenters. So I want to thank all the presenters. We are out of time. And, it's awful, right? Because this is where we would start a really cool conversation. So I want to thank folks for just adjusting to the limited time that we had, and encourage ourselves to find more spaces of this nature, continue to contribute to this space, continue to stay committed to this space, this section, continue to grow it, invite your friends. We need more paper proposals. We need more folks to propose panels, more folks to mentor these topics, and to continue supporting those that are coming up the ranks. So excited to see folks like Justina coming in as an undergrad and killing it at this stage. So keep inviting your colleagues to the space. Let's keep growing it. So thank you everyone for joining us today, for the amazing conversations, for the great research, and let's do this again next year for NCOBPS, but also for all of the other conferences. Let's continue to build out this area of research.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.